To be here. Thank you, Corlica, for inviting me to speak about, I always think this is a new research project, my working with 3D, but I actually started in 2013. So that makes it almost 10 years. So maybe I should stop thinking of myself of new to 3D. But I've been working with a colleague and we've been thinking about new forms of scholarly editing and digital scholarship in the form of 3D, and something that we're calling 3D digital scholarly editions, which is kind of an oxymoron for most people. So I work with a colleague. This idea began with my colleague Kostas Papadopoulos. He's an archaeologist of the Greek Neolithic period. And as you heard, I'm an Irish modernist. We started to work together, and you would think we would have nothing in common, but I already had this 3D project on the Battle of Mount Street Bridge, which I'll explain to you. And he is a 3D scholar. And so together we thought about some of the issues involved with 3D scholarship and my experience as an editor in traditional scholarly editing. And we came up with the idea of 3D, the 3D model, not as the text, not being a written text, as we've been hearing over the last day, and most of you are familiar with, but the text being the 3D model of a digital scholarly edition. So the text could be, in this case, any kind of artifact. It could be a building, it could be a vase, it could be a whole scene, a whole city. And that we're considering the text. We got a few grants when we were working together in Ireland, but a couple of years ago, we got a very large Dutch infrastructure grant called Pure 3D. We're about in the middle of it. And we're creating an infrastructure for 3D scholarship that is going to be not only open to people in the Netherlands, but ideally worldwide. And we will be having a call for new projects in the spring. So if you're doing research in this area and have models, you might consider applying to do an edition. So much of my talk today is due to the work that we're doing together in this Pure 3D project. We have a PhD and quite a number of developers from Claria. We also have quite a lot of, we've acquired a 7th test project. Most of them, but not all, are in cultural heritage. So with lots of museums and other kinds of cultural institutions. So I am an old-fashioned scholarly editor. I started off my master's degree with this book, this annotated book of McGreevy's poems. And by 2000, when digital humanities, or at the time humanities computing, was just getting started, I started working on my first digital humanities project. It's all on the sky. Thomas McGreevy, who's a fairly obscure Irish poet and art critic, and I created this McGreevy edition. And since then, I've created lots of others, usually with things like TEI, and that's fairly standard. So the idea behind these scholarly editions, in my opinion at least, has been, the digital scholarly editions has been to use the technologies that we have available. When I worked in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started with SGML. And what I wanted to do, I couldn't do. Now I can do it because the technologies have kind of caught up. But the idea behind them, I think, is to use these technologies to find ways to present, to analyze, to augment text, to contextualize them, to illuminate them. More recently, to allow the public to engage with us in creating them. In short, I think a rationale for digital scholarly editions is to create a knowledge site for dissemination, for research, with the affordances of whatever the medium is that we're working in. Because now, of course, we can work in all kinds of other mediums, phones, iPads, etc. What's been really exciting in working in digital scholarly editions all these years has been rethinking of what I'm calling this knowledge site from a really constrained information space, i.e. the book, in which annotation and contextualization was delivered usually at the bottom of the page or maybe at the back or the front of the book. So we were always condensing because we didn't have a lot of space. But now we have this unbounded or almost unbounded digital space and we can potentially link the entirety of the World Wide Web to our editions. And in fact, I'll show you that, an example of that in a little while. So really this shift from constrained to almost unbounded, I think forced us as editors to think no longer about sites of textual compression, but as what I call these decentered webs of textuality. So if I say in Derridian terms, the digital archive is a space for gathering text on a specific theme, individual topic, expanding the world of its creation into an achronic space for inscription and investigation. And that's my definition. So what happens when we put into this definition, this space, 3D models? So when I began working with Costas, I began to realize that these webs of intertextuality were not available to those working with 3D. I didn't realize how easy, no matter how difficult you think TEI is, how easy we had it working with text. So typically a lot of teams traditionally for many years, for decades, have been working with 3D models, architecture, archaeology, to build for them to do analysis. But there's so much difficulty in using these models on the web that typically they just take screenshots and put them in articles if they can. Quite a number use YouTube and create like a video, moving through the model. But still, that does not allow people like us outside the team to really work with the model and understand how to use it as an analytical tool. There's no standardization for 3D. There's little software to display them on the web. Browser support is variable. I can tell you my Mount Street Bridge project that I said I began in 2013 has at least gone through 5 iterations. Just when we launched our project the first time, we were using Unity, and you could put it on a browser, and it's like within months, the browser stopped having support for Unity. So I keep remaking this project in different 3D formats because the technologies keep changing. There's also no schema, nothing like TEI. There's no schemas, no metadata, no way to deal with paradata. It's really kind of, I think, how I felt it was, even when I came in the late 90s to digital scholarship, TEI was already established. So I think it must have been like starting in the 80s in digital scholarship. So we decided to combine our expertise, and what would it mean to apply the principles that I've been talking about for 3D digital scholarly editions to 3D models? So the roles for scholarly editions, typical, originate from analog texts, and they're really clear-cut. There's an author, like, as you heard, I was an Irish scholar, so here's James Joyce, who lived not so far away from here in Trieste. And the editor is a man named Hans Walter Gabler, and it's published at a particular time in 1984 by Random House. So we understand what the roles are. But with the Ulysses example, the role of the editor is to stabilize the text, to figure out what Joyce would have wanted if he got everything he wanted, maybe at a particular point of time. We call this authorial attention. It's been deprecated a bit. But with 3D models, if we think of the model as a text, this is one of mine from 25 Northumberland Road, the battle I'll talk about. Who's the author? Is the model is, of course, a reproduction here of a building. So who's the author? Is it the person who made the model? Is it the person who made the building? Is there no author as such? What could be the analogy for who's the author of this text? The modeler who created the surrogate, maybe you can be likened to the author of the novel, maybe. But then who's the editor? So the parallels are not perfect, I'll say that. But I think there's still a case for thinking of the author of the model as the modeler, particularly in the case, as you see here, of reconstructions. And this is some of Costas's work. There's some Neolithic figurines from a dig that he's been working on in Greece. So if the modeler is recreating an ancient building or reconstructing an artifact out of fragments, maybe, as I said, this would be a good case for thinking of this as the author. Nevertheless, I'm still going to use this word text. So in the case of 3D, digital scholarly editions, we're not trying, as I said, to restore authorial intention, but we're trying to represent the object or the world being modeled. And I think that's a really crucial difference. So in the case of objects that exist, like these two, these are from a student project of mine, we're trying to create as faithfully as possible a representation that we can use a method such as photogrammetry that was used here. So the 3D model object in itself is in itself a representation. It's a domain-specific model that simplifies the complexity of the environment being represented. We always do some simplification when we create digital surrogates. So here I think maybe the author and the editor, they can be the same, because around this we might create an apparatus, annotation. So I'm also taking on the editorial role. So I think here, really the modeler, the author, the editor's intention is different in the text reconstruction process. And to further complicate, although we do get this in more traditional scholarly editions, there's a possibility of more dynamic annotation. It may be things with linked data, computer vision. So the role of the editor, I think, can also be extended to non-human actors. When modeling objects, particularly of worlds that don't exist or exist maybe in some fragmentary form, the reconstructions are much more speculative and can be used as a heuristic tool from which to build knowledge about spatial and temporal environments. And I think you can use then the 3D model to analyze things like sound and light. So I think these reconstructions can force researchers or allow researchers to look at evidence anew, to seek out evidence that we often overlook when we're writing more traditional articles, so that we can build this evidence into the model and then analyze it further. So you're going to see lots of these models of Mount Street, and they are many of the different versions that we've had over the years. But in thinking about these kinds of objects, these models as digital scholarly editions, I think they're not unlike their text-based counterparts in terms of there being assemblages, or what I'm stealing this, machines of knowledge. This is from Deleuze and Guattari. They become open objects that can be read and understood through and by their means of production and reception. They can be used to revisit long-standing textual practices such as annotation and apparatus and commentary and interlinked discourses. And they provide, I think, a palette for both textual and contextual study. So this model of thinking of editions repositions the editor, not as an objective arbiter of the text, but I think more like a hunter-gatherer, a constructor of this dynamic rhizomic knowledge site. So what are these knowledge sites if you think of 3D scholarship? What exactly is an annotation? We use annotations in addition to the text. We can use audio, we can use video, any kind of multimedia can be embedded also in 3D. But in a 3D model, could an annotation be changing the camera view, having the user look at a specific point in the model? Is this an annotation? Would layering objects, as you see on this slide, underneath the model be an annotation? Because we've added it, like you add annotation to a text. Can annotation be activated in more ways than traditional text-based annotations that are generated by the user in response to working with the model itself? Annotation can also contain linked data, where we reach out to the web to bring in information to our particular knowledge site. So as academics, we've been schooled to create and understand the train of scholarship embedded in print-based annotative environments. It's less clear how we interpret machine-generated annotation, like you see here with linked data being brought into this. This is an 18th century Dutch building. It's a house. So how do we create the interface that makes it clear to users that we have not created this, but it's coming in via linked data? So our authority is different over it. How do we create a knowledge production site and dissemination that's multimodal, that's interactive, and even with 3D, multisensorial? So I think this kind of environment raises new issues, how to make clear provenance, intention, context for the users as well as for the scholarly record. So in reconstructions like these, can adding textures, so obviously the buildings when they dig them do not look like this now. Somebody has added textures thinking, with good reason, we hope, this is what these bricks look like. This is what this mosaic of the floor looked like. Can these be considered annotation? Because they're being added as we add information to a text. Archaeologists have wrestled with these issues for many years. It's not new. So some of you may have noticed sometimes you go to a physical reconstruction site and you see the bricks are a slightly different color. So it's to indicate that this is being reconstructed. We can obviously do this in a 3D world. And there is a move away from these kinds of reconstructions, as you see in the bottom, because they look so perfect. And we don't know that that's how it looks. So we really need to be clear. But with 3D reconstructions, we can have both. We can have the beautiful, what we think is a reconstructed, but then we can also have a model that shows us, well, what the site looks like today, but also what we think we can show our process in reconstruction so that a user can see all those stages, which we obviously cannot do in real life. So I think models like this have tried to do this. So I think we would also consider this an annotation because you're, again, adding information, but just not in textual form. Typically, archaeologists show structures, they collect information during an excavation, and excavations can last many, many, many years. And they create these notebooks. They can have hundreds of these notebooks. Eventually, they go usually into some archaeology depot or an archive, and maybe some people can get access to them. Mostly because as you dig, you destroy the evidence. So somehow they need to document what they found, and they do it now with these notebooks, with videos, with audio, with all kinds of multimedia now. And they call this paradata. These two can form part of maybe not the annotative structure, but maybe the apparatus that surrounds the 3D model. This, I think, is a trickier example, and we have this in the traditional text-based world as well. Do we include everything, or are we selective in what we include? Do we digitize the entire notebook or all the notebooks, hundreds of them, and let people get access to them? Do we create an assemblage of all this data? Because all this data is often spread over many locations. So the notebooks might be in an archive, the fragments might be in a depot somewhere else, the beautiful pieces might be in a museum. So is this a way, using 3D as the center, to reconstruct all of what has been found? If the goal of the edition is to create a knowledge site to allow scholars who did not participate in the excavation to make sense of the vast amount of materials, well then, what is the role of the editor? Is it just to include everything? Or is it, as we think of ourselves as editors, to select and organize so that the model can be read back through its creation, allowing other scholars to form their own hypothesis about the original site as well as the reconstruction, as opposed to saying, here's everything, you figure it out. And in the case of, I think, particularly archaeological digs, well, I don't see anybody have the time and energy and the ability it would take half their life to go through all these thousands of documents, shards. So I do think here an editorial role is really required. As I said earlier, the models contain interactive content. And so, for example, a medieval church that maybe still exists, but exists differently because it's been added onto, lights, heating have been put in. You could reconstruct the medieval church to its original dimensions so that a musicologist, for example, could reconstruct the sonic spaces that would have existed 1,000 years ago. Annotations can be active. They could be triggered by the user based on their interaction within the virtual environment. And here you can see, and I'll show this live in a little while, you can see the outside of this building 25, but one of our annotation, or I think of it as annotation, brings you into the building so you could see the camera view outside, what the Irish soldiers inside were looking at when they looked out at the British coming down the road. I'll explain this in a couple of minutes. So I think the goal of the annotation is that they should supply users with the tools to understand the representation, in our case, the model, historically, socially, and or culturally, as well as the decision-making process in the creation of this recreation, this reconstruction. So I like this quote. It's from some of our colleagues in the Netherlands. There's a project called Virtual Interiors, and I'll show some of their designs for their viewer, what we call the viewer, the front end. And they've written about their 3D project very eloquently. And I really like this quote because they think of the creation of the 3D edition as 3 steps, which I would agree with, and an iterative process. So the first step is creating knowledge where you get new insights as the team, and you make the reconstruction, including the annotation. And this is followed, and I think this is really important, not just in any 3D edition, but I have to say, I think in any research, but particularly in digital projects. And the second stage, I think, is sharing the edition. Often we do this with our colleagues in places like this, but increasingly, I think we need to do it also with the public and get feedback on your reconstruction. And then you take that on board and recreate your edition. And this is followed by another discovery phase where users can discover, maybe they can create additional annotation through through interaction with the model, so a collaborative 3D process, or using the model for their own scholarship and writing articles or building on it, whatever they do, or if they're the public, just enjoying it and learning from it. So what holds all of this 3D digital scholarly edition together? I can tell you we're in the middle of figuring this out, and it is not an easy answer. So my very simple model is on the left. At the top end is a viewer, what you've been looking at, but you'll look at a live one soon. Then you have a database that's controlling what comes up from the preservation repository and what goes up further into the viewer or goes down from a request and brings it up. So that's a fairly simple. The pictures on the right are from our colleagues who we work with in DARIAH in the Netherlands. It's the Dutch National Research Infrastructure for Humanities and Social Science. And this is what we're building right now, because there really aren't any repositories that do this. We felt strongly when we got the grant, we wanted there to be a preservation repository, because one of the most difficult, yes, I see you nodding, one of the most difficult things with these models is just keeping them. They are so big, they're so unwieldy. We have so many versions of Mount Street. I cannot tell you how many we have. And a model's just not one 3D object. But for example, what I showed you earlier, it's the model, but it also has all these textures. So there can be hundreds of files that go with it to show the brick, the colors, the windows, the windowsills. So keeping all these together in a place is really important. Mostly what happens, I think, with a lot of teams, once you run out of server space or your university, like with so many other projects, they just disappear, and so does the knowledge. And people then redo this again. So we felt strongly we wanted to have the preservation part, so people who create their editions could store all their bits and pieces, all their models, their annotation, everything else, their videos, whatever. And they can have control over who gets access and when. So it could be, I don't allow anyone to get access, but in 10 years, I'm happy for anyone to take them. Or if you send me an email, maybe I will give you access. So just like other preservation repositories, we will have reuse privileges. So this is what we're doing now. Also, there's metadata. As I said earlier, there's not really any good 3D metadata schemes. There's one called Karari, which we are looking at, which looks very good. It doesn't do the whole cycle. So it doesn't have, say, preservation. We are looking at, well, we'll probably use Dublin Core as well. And maybe, which is a little bit of a blast from the past for any librarians still in the room or archivists, we're also looking at METs. We also want to add semantic richness to the model itself in terms of tagging parts of the model to create the annotation layer itself. And for the viewer that I'm going to show you, Voyager, they use JSON. This is a little clip of it. And we think theoretically we can, once we create a model on a spatial annotation on a spatial point in the model, we should be able to take that model and put it in a different viewer, we hope, with this JSON file, and the annotation should come out in the right place spatially. So we need to keep track, as I said, of all these states in the model, of the annotation, where on the model the annotation is spatially important, both the longitude and the latitude within the model. We have to keep track of all the assets, where they're being pulled from into the interface via other sources. Sometimes they're within the database, sometimes they're coming from outside, sometimes they're linked open data, sometimes they're hyperlinked, permissions, rights, who's responsible. As I said, we don't see a lot of models for this. And we hope in Pure 3D we'll be able to at least propose a model for other types of scholarly work this way. So finally, my Mount Street Bridge model. So I've been talking about somewhat abstractly about 3D models, but now I'm going to share with you the project that I've been working on since 2013. And this model that I'm going to show you, not this model, this is an older one that could be the Unity model, I think, because it has very high resolution. And it's called Contested Memories, the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. And it's a key battle in the Irish uprising in Easter 1916, which was a rebellion that took place in April, beginning on Easter Monday. And it was over by the Saturday because the British put it down. There were several other rebellions in Ireland. You might remember Ireland was, it's called the first colony of the British Empire. The British had colonized it for about 800 years, and there were many other uprisings, but they were all unsuccessful. One might argue that this one was unsuccessful because the British put it down in less than a week. However, by December 1921, Ireland did gain independence. And this is the spark that started it. So the Battle of Mount Street Bridge was the first major encounter between the British forces that were brought in to put down the rising. And you remember 1916, we were in the middle of the First World War. There were, of course, many British and Irish soldiers training in Ireland. But then the British brought these recruits. In fact, they were called Sherwood Foresters from Nottingham. They were in the middle of their training for the Western Front, fighting on these open fields. Nobody had any training in what we might call urban warfare, or fighting in built-up spaces, they call them. And they were brought in. They were marched down the road from the port that they came in. They were going to the city center, to Trinity College, and they get stopped on the way by 17 Irish soldiers who were quite poorly trained with all kinds of different guns and ammo. Much of the ammo did not fit in the guns that they were issued. So there were these 17 guys, and we figured out 1,750 British soldiers to put them down. They were on 4 separate buildings on Northumberland Road. You can see it here. The one that we've worked on the most is the model that I'll have, 25 Northumberland. It's the first one. But then you can see down the road Parochial Hall, the schoolhouse, and all the way to the right, Clan William Hall. And we plan on doing 3D models like I show you for each of these. And with the new interface I'm going to be showing you as well, we'd like to do the whole scene. Eventually, the British were able to defeat the Irish at this location. It took them most of the day, which is quite surprising, given that there were only 17 of these guys, Irish. Eventually, they came with hand grenades and some cannon and just blasted the Irish out. So the research question I started with, this was a Mellon-funded grant, which was to use a 3D model to answer a research question that you would find very difficult to answer using traditional, even digital methods. So the research question was, how many British casualties were there? We knew how many Irish there were. That was easy, 4 out of 17. But for the British, we had casualty numbers for the last 100 years, literally, ranging from 150 to 350. So we did come to a conclusion. I won't leave you in suspense. It was 160, which was very near the original British number from the British records around the time, their war histories, their battalion histories. But oddly enough, and this is what really struck me about this research, we didn't come to that number because of the model. We tried, I cannot tell you how many ways, to model the battle. I mean, we're not like a gaming company. We couldn't put 1,750 soldiers in the scene. We couldn't even put 1 battalion we couldn't even put a company in the scene. We couldn't even put 100 of them. So instead of people, because I didn't want representational figures, and if you want to know why, you can ask me later. So we had these like little lozenges, like moving around the scenes. But even that we couldn't model. We just didn't have the computational power. But something else happened when we were doing this. And this was my aha moment. And we got so much information because we wanted to build it into the model. We wanted to know where there were 7 companies of this 2 divisions, 7 companies. There would have been 8, but 1 was left behind in the UK. We tried to figure out where they were at any moment in time. So it's both spatially and temporally. We had spreadsheets, we draw maps, all so that we could model it. I went out with a colleague, this was our Sunday morning excursion, to go to all the British cemeteries in Dublin to see, could we figure out which British, the Sherwood Foresters were buried in Dublin, because mostly the British bury soldiers where they fall. They don't tend to repatriate. So we gathered so much data. Even that is too big to store anywhere. It's in the cloud now. So we had all this data. We worked for a couple of years on this, but it wasn't until we actually started engaging with the scene when it was finished and narrating the battle with our modeler, kind of going through the scene, that me and the historian, his name Billy Campbell, I worked with, ex-military, that we had this aha moment. We both had it individually, but we didn't talk about it till later, that somehow the understanding what happened spatially and temporally clicked in a way that gathering all this other data did not. And it was this spatial awareness that even, I mean, the street looks kind of like this today. We walked down that street so many times, but it was something about this 3D reconstruction that allowed us to have this aha moment. So we created out of it what I would call a different mental model of what transpired on that day in 1916. But afterwards I felt, okay, we had our aha moment, we've written articles, what about anybody else who wants to do it, who understand it, and have that same understanding or a different understanding, that's fine. So typically, models like this have a real wow factor. They're beautiful, they're amazing. You think, wow, how did someone reconstruct that so beautifully? But after that wow factor, it's a total deflation. So we wanted to create a space where other people could have some of the experience we did to understand what happened, in this case, through a scholarly practice, such as an addition. So now I'd like to do something that nobody ever likes doing, going to a live demo, and we'll see, does it work? Let me just escape out of this and go to here. But it didn't escape there. Oh, it does. So this is, yes, our live model. Is that okay? Do they see it online? Oh, do you need to reshare a different screen? Okay. So if you know, we just, we had this behind, you know, just a little password till recently, but we took it off because now we've gone through surveys. I did a focus group in Dublin in June, and we've had other feedback. So now we feel we can make this public. So if you want to go to the Pure 3D site, I'm sure we link it, but I'll tell my colleague maybe to link it if anybody wants to go back. So this is the first building. As I said, we plan on doing several because this particular software, it's called Voyager. It's created by the Smithsonian because the first model they worked with was Voyager from Apollo 11, the capsule. And so it's created, I think, well, yes, I do think. I think it's created for, well, it's created for the Smithsonian, but really I don't know if anybody is here from any museums or archives or heritage. Some people were here yesterday or online. I do think, in my opinion, this does work better for the kind of audience that you would typically find, like a museum audience or more public audience. Nevertheless, we are doing quite a lot of additions, and it has some really nice features. So you can take the model, navigate around. You can get to it by various means. The easiest way, and if I can, this is one of the problems sometimes we have. And this is a issue with resolution. So you can do things like sharing, but what I'm trying to get to is, the tour, the first tour is on. You can create what they call tours. And it's, well, a tour. It's like a guided interaction through the model. They have a couple of ways of using the, what do you call them, the annotation where you put them. For this one, we tested putting it on the top of the model, but we're also testing putting it on the right. So when I said about camera views, this is what you're looking at now. So this guide, so I think also this is an annotation because we're guiding your attention to particular locations. You can see you can embed any kind of multimedia in it. And here you would have an opportunity to, and normally you can see this, but it's a little awkward because I think of the resolution of this screen. You have an annotation, you can just go to that through the read more, or you can continue with the tour. So for this, we're trying to lead people through the first hours of the battle, since this is the first building that they came to. One of the things that I find is very interesting, if you look at these, they're stored in the system as little HTML articles. They're about 250 words. They're really short. And I worked with quite a number of scholars in Tokyo this summer creating their editions. And they found it really, really hard because they're not trained as editors to write really short things. So as an editor, you're practiced in writing annotation like this one you see on the left, like 2 sentences. We're trained to traditionally as academics to write long things like articles. So this was really hard for them to condense down to only the most essential for the audience that they're creating for. So you can go to this. I won't go through very much. This is the man, Michael Malone. He's in fact one of the 2 people who were killed. Supposedly he was a crack shot, and he had a handgun mounted on a rifle, and it was they're called Peter the Painters. And what we discovered on Sketchfab is there are many people who are interested in old guns, and we got this on Sketchfab. So you can even embed other models that are on the web or your own. The one really bad feedback we got was this audio, which was the gun firing. So we actually fired what we think was his gun, which was turned into the National Museum in the 1930s. And one of the people on my project team was the curator at the time. But why they didn't like it is they weren't prepared for the gunshots. So all the other audio are people speaking. And so they really got a bit of a shock to hear these guns. So we thought it was probably a little, probably unnecessary, and we are going to take it off. Or we would have to prepare someone for what's coming, which I think is fair enough. So anyway, you can see these people liked because they were audios of people speaking. Oh no, this is the gunshots. God, I did it to you. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I forgot where they were. But we felt this is a scholarly edition, and you have to have things like references. So we spent, I cannot tell you, and I have to say, I did this with my students. I had an honors class, and I had 3 students who really engaged in creating these tours. And we spent a lot of time thinking, where will we put the references? You know, do we put them at the bottom of every single paragraph? But at the end, since we use the same set of references everywhere, we put them at the end. But we felt strongly people should be able to recreate our scholarship. In the larger project that we're doing with Pure 3D, what I think we might do is, what we have to decide is we can bring in, this is what our developers would like us to do because there's so much link rot, is bring in our sources as long as we have permission or they're freely available, and can have them contained within our architecture so that we won't worry that they'll disappear. So anyway, you see we have 3 tours. I'm just going to do this one really quickly because it has the most interesting, what I think, annotation. So we go into the building at one point, because this is like the last stand where we know Michael Malone was shot. So anyway, now I have to stop sharing, going back again. Okay. So anyone who's interested, Smithsonian has this product. It's freely available. One can put it on their server and work with it. We're working with them quite a lot on it, and they're really fabulous to work with. And they have made a lot of improvements because of our collaboration, and they are actively working on it. So I would recommend it, particularly for people who are institutions. And here's one of the first ones they did, their Apollo 11, which is why it's called Voyager. I worked, as I said, in Tokyo over the summer with some colleagues. They had a wide variety of models that they were using and stories they wanted to tell. It's actually called Voyager Story. I think it is much better as a narrative. But this is an instrument. I don't know if anyone knows what it is. Does it say it? Oh, yes, hurdy-gurdy. Does anyone know, familiar with it? It's this medieval, very peculiar kind of proto-violin. Yeah, you have to turn it, and it has this very peculiar sound as well. So he did a fabulous job in annotating it, I thought. Also, and this was for a public audience, there was another woman, his name was Shintaro Nozami, was interested in doing Benin heads, the statues for her class. So she was doing this for her undergraduate class to better understand the whole issues around the Benin heads, from how and when they were taken to the whole reparation. This is one of our project partners, the Rembrandt House. They have models of the Rembrandt House. They've used them in many ways, but they're very interested in exploring how they can add more within the model itself. They have a lot of information. So they have the models here and lots of information here on the website. And now they're interested, how do we put it together? We have, one of our partners is a Netherlands mining museum, and they have a new collection of mining lamps. So they're using that. And another one is called the Van Bommel Van Dam. It's a modern art museum, also in the Netherlands. This is Mr. Van Bommel, Van Dam, and they picked a lot of very contemporary art. So very, very different project partners to help us test the infrastructure we're creating. This is the view of virtual interiors, that nice quote that I showed you before, and we really love this, and we were hoping to adopt it somewhat wholesale as a second viewer, but turned out we're not able to do it. But what I really like about this, and it models, as it were, some of the designs that Costas and I did in a previous other Mellon project, where you have the model on the left and lots of annotation on the right. You can do that with Smithsonian as well. What I liked about this is they have confidence indexes. Remember I said before that with particularly reconstructions, you want to show what's being reconstructed and how confident you are in the reconstruction. In this case, that there was a picture here, and B, it was this particular picture. Also, they bring in linked data, which we hadn't thought of, which I really liked. So for them, it makes sense. So whatever this picture is, here's like all the other pictures by this artist, or pictures like this one. So I really like that. They also have lots of analysis features that people would be interested if they want to analyze the scene itself. And I really like this one because they have the ability to change the lighting. So this is what the room would have looked like at night with just the candlesticks. And that's important, I think, for lots of reconstructions, historical reconstructions, when you want to know how people used, for example, interior spaces. So this is something that we're going to probably reconstruct, but probably differently as a second, more, let's say, scholarly viewer. So just to close, the scholarly edition, what I wanted to talk about today, the 3D scholarly edition, is much more than the interface that the user interacts with. Of course, at some level, it might be the most important, because if the viewer is not engaging, interesting, clear, easy to use, users won't engage with it. We're still exploring what exactly annotation is and what infrastructure is needed to support this annotation. We are working a lot in how to work with our peers, so how to do training, so we can have our peers create such editions out of a wide range of materials, objects and historical materials. Also, with what we were talking about with Toma yesterday, we're also talking about peer review. So what does it mean to peer review? And we have a meeting, I think, next week when I get back, about how to peer review the editions that we have now. We're working on this project for 2 years more. So please, if you're interested, follow us and look for a call for papers if you are working with any material objects and think you would like to have this treatment for it. because we're going to have a new call for projects in the spring. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you much for your interesting presentation and even small history lecture.
Yes.
So yes, I think that these 3D related issues and topics are very interesting for a lot of people. So I think that maybe there will be some questions for you from the public. Daria, please.
I have three questions. One is, how are you compatible with or integrated with the partnership?
That's easy. Right now we're not. But I did see an announcement from them recently come by. Are you involved with Time Machine?
No.
So
I think a lot of what you're doing.
yes.
I get really people there.
Yes, and there is an Amsterdam Time Machine. And one of the people we work with on virtual interiors is involved in the Amsterdam Time Machine. So maybe you remind me that I should ask her.
Sorry, I was also sorry for interaction. Since I machine language, so it was also my way to connect with that because there are really lots of overlap.
So maybe we should, yeah.
Of infrastructure, they will develop various projects. One of the features of Time Machine, one of the features of Time Machine, from last year, they are making map of projects like this for whole Europe. To see and to make the map of projects that are using and what type of technology they are using, to see what is useful for one type of material, what purposes, and for what implementation each step of first step or difference and models for describing technology, software, describing it's really beautiful, and I think all the articles love your ideas, but there are also lots of things that you present here that are very much complementary with many digital archives projects that are going right now. So I think what I want to do
I mean, I think one of the very interesting things is archives, museums have been creating these 3D models for years, and they just kind of sit there. And you can print them out. So in my office, I have a collection of really cheap plastic printouts of 3D models, which people love, because I think you can touch them. But in a way, this is a way. So some of the models I showed you, in fact, almost all the models from my colleagues in Tokyo, because I was not going because of COVID restrictions. And I was going and there were they had no models. So I said, well, what will we do? You have no models. And we said, oh, we'll get them from Sketchfab. And they were loads of models. All the ones I showed you were from institutions. So I think for me, one of the things I've always been interested in is how can we work as digital humanists better with archives and museums with heritage. The institutions keep making this stuff available and we don't necessarily, we're not always able to use it, or it's hard to use, document by document isn't, what we do anymore. But you can, because they're all easy, you suck them in, you could put them here, you can annotate them, and you can offer them back to the institution. This is just an iframe. So an institution could take this and just put it back, as it were, on their site. So I think this is a really great collaborative opportunity.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
This is like prototype of collaboration model.
So this discussion makes me think when we do our call for projects coming up in the spring, maybe we should have some that we would particularly favor. I have to ask Costas, and he watches the video and he sees it before I say it to him, that maybe we would favor or encourage collaborations between institutions and academics using, because it's hard to make the 3D models. And most academics, I think, just want to annotate them. They don't want to necessarily learn photogrammetry. I mean, some do, but they don't necessarily want to make the model. So I think it's a really, and of course, the archivists, the curators have a lot of information as well about these objects that could be a nice collaboration. So maybe that would be a nice idea. You had two other questions.
Very quick. The second one is, now everything that you do with respect to annotation is manual work. Maybe you could have a say before that with some advanced text mining and speech technologies to give you a little bit of a boost, and then you just refine what you get from it.
Text mining in what way?
For example, the text summarization, any task that you have at hand, you said that your editors struggle with text summarization, you could help them with text summarization automatically, have knowledge extraction from your archives and just present, for example, what the relevant items.
Yes, so that's a really interesting suggestion, and it's a debate that has been going on, I think, in the digital scholarly editing community for a long time, particularly with developers, computer scientists, who want to automate the process. And lots of editors say, well, but this is my scholarship. Like, this is my work that I'm doing. I'm taking all these sources, just like I write an article, and I'm creating the annotation and deciding, you know, just like with an article, a beginning, middle, and end, like I'm creating the narration that you are going through, and that is my scholarship. So I think it's a really interesting question about what is the role of the non-human actors in these editions. And I don't have a very good, I don't come down either way, but I know this is a conversation we've had for a long time. What was your third question?
And my final question is that there could be a lot of people in this citizen science, which in the whole presented, I also think is step 2 in the approach. Could you open this up for citizen science and then?
Yes, I think you could. So one of the things my developers desperately wanted to do, the developers I'm working with, was have a place for collaborative annotation. I think on our grant we will not get there, even though it's €1 million. As you know, things are expensive in the Netherlands. We're on a project together, and we're comparing how expensive people are. And I don't think we'll get there. We'll be very thrilled if we get to the point of building the infrastructure that I had showed you kind of on the left. But it is something we have in mind. As I said, I did a focus group in Ireland. So I'm a member of this Western Front Association, which is not populated by academics. It's really an association for people interested in the First World War, and mostly people who are not academics, who, you know, have family members, et cetera, et cetera. And I did a fabulous focus group with them. Their median age, I think, was 65. Not people who were wildly computer literate. And they gave me such fabulous feedback and also other information. So I could imagine doing sessions, even with the technologies we have now, to bring in, well, I did this as a student project, but to bring in people who may have knowledge about a particular time, space, and actually do annotation that way. Right now, it's a little clunky, sorry, Voyager people, to work in Voyager. Although we are working on a kind of form interface, which I think would also make it much easier for people to contribute. So yes, I could see that absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful presentation, and it's really fun. I can see those 3D models. Coming from a more textual disability-driven framework, I was always taught to separate data and application. And to me, it seems really to be very much intertwined in at least on the front end side.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on how preservation of kind of, you said, that it's an iframe, you can do it anywhere. How do I preserve, digitally preserve an iframe?
So that's the infrastructure part. So in the infrastructure, well, if we add in all our paradata, that, and in my case, that would be, all these things that we've collected, witness statements, maps that we've created, blah, 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 that will be absolutely separate from the viewer. So much so that what we would like, although I'm not sure it's going to happen as seamlessly as the developers think, theoretically, we could have the annotation I was showing you pulled into different environments because it will live separately from the viewer itself. So what you get now at the top level is a package, but ideally, if we expose the data, and there could be ifs on that for all kinds of proprietary reasons, you should be able to get to that as well. And in one of our, I didn't put it here, but we have wireframes that we've worked on for the infrastructure. You should be able to get to any of the objects in the infrastructure. So you might search on, remember I showed you that guy, Michael Malone, the one who I said was killed. If you search on him, you would see that we have a photograph. You would see the first thing you would get to is the model where he appears, then a photograph, any kind of textual information, and anything associated with him, like his gun. So all those things should be extractable as well. Whether we can get there, this is our goal for this version of the interface. Whether we could get there or not, I'm not sure, but that's included in the wireframe. So yes, there would be this separation. But what you get for this view, the viewer view, is this integrated, just like scholarly edition part. But that is a very good point, because it should be also that someone could theoretically come along and do a third one and reuse what we have, but then add other information that they've found, or just use it in a very different, maybe there'll be a ton of Irish 1916 ones and someone wants to include it somewhere, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yeah.
And we have one final question.
Wonderful. Explanations. I would like to hear your opinion, however, because you've been about something that is more or less terminological edge and the caveats as well. So bearing in mind that digitization and digitalization terminologically are not necessarily identical terms, whereas the analog to digital conversion is called digitization, or a process is called digitalization. What is, in your practice, the greatest digitalizers caveats? Is it just a matter of a lack of standardization, or is it more for that?
Or is it the?
For a digitalization.
No, what was this second part of your?
What are the caveats? What are the dangers when objectifying the text?
The text being the model. The text being the model in this case. Yeah. I think it is the same dangers that exist for all representations. So when we write this out in print, we usually put PRE in parentheses, presentations, because of course any representation is not the object itself, it's an interpretive act. And one of the things I think we have to be careful about is making clear what that interpretation is. And in some of those models I showed you earlier, where you just see a beautiful Roman villa, I mean, to the unsuspect, that's that wow factor, and you think that's how it looked. So I think we have a real role and an obligation when we recreate the past, we represent it, to be clear about what is our interpretation and what you could write this out, but it is very tedious. And I don't know who would read it. I mean, maybe other archaeologists would read it for a site, but I think for the public, those confident indexes, those changes in colors, I think is very important. I think about mine as well, because my goal, and it also has to do with the goals. So for example, my goal in contested memories is not to recreate necessarily this one block, using the American term, on Northumberland Road. Like, I don't, you could walk down that block and the buildings look pretty much the same. They look the same. The only thing that's different is the trees are taller. And we have one building that was destroyed that we reconstructed from photographs. So in my case, I feel I need to talk about the process that got us there, but the reconstruction is not reconstructing something that is not there anymore. Whereas one of our partners, I didn't show it, is called the 4D Lab, and they have a quite large model where they've reconstructed what was Jewish Amsterdam in the 17th century. Their purpose is much different. It's not to talk about Jewish Amsterdam. It's to talk about this excavation project and the reconstruction. So I think they will be a very traditional archaeological use of our software. And I think for the rest of us, the models that I showed you, it's really, how can I use this as a palette to create context and information and a different space around which to bring people closer to, let's say, objects of historical or cultural interest. So I think the answer is it depends, but I think even in my case, I have to be clear about how I got to this model you're looking at. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to end this session. Thank you once again for your wonderful presentation. It is a great honor to have you here. I'm really grateful that you came to Rijeka due to all the adventure.
Yes, we had some
organization of your trip. So yeah, thank you once again. So we can.
For the opportunity, and if anybody looks at the model, the Voyager, and you have feedback or you're interested, please get in touch, because we're always looking for feedback and we're always interested in seeing who might be interested in doing similar work. So thank you very much.
Okay. Now we will